started, which is very good. I got that bit right. That's good. Just before I introduce David, just a couple of sort of adverts, please. The next Finance Network meeting is December the 15th. I hope you've got that date in your diaries, but if not, December the 15th. The subject will be charity structures, and Nick Vaughan will be talking to us about charity structures. I think that's going to be an interesting meeting. He's going to be looking around the use of subsidiaries for non-primary purpose trading, but also perhaps for some primary purpose trading. He'll be looking at risk issues, governance, financing aspects for subsidiaries, and also shared assets, that sort of thing. So anyone that runs or works with a subsidiary trading company, I think that will be an interesting meeting. So that's December the 15th. And could I also please just draw attention to the masterclass, the finance masterclass that we're planning for next year. That's going to be virtual, and it will work between the 10th of January and the 27th of February. The deadline for applications is the 30th of November. There have been 2 or 3 communications about this already. If you've missed it and you can't find the communication about it, drop me an email after today's event and I can send you the application and details. But we're getting close to the cut-off point for applications for that. That's a masterclass on financial matters for trustees as well as CEOs and senior staff between the 10th of January and the 27th of February. So that's the adverts done. Let me now turn to today's meeting. And I should just add that we will be sharing the slides and the recording of this session later. But I have to add that will be as soon as John returns to work, because he's got the skill and the expertise to manage the recording and to share that link, which is beyond my ken. But there we go. But we will share it. Do rest assured on that. So I'd like to welcome David Brown. David has come to us via Cranfield Trust, where he's a volunteer consultant. He does a lot of work for Cranfield. He's got a very impressive CV. I'll leave him to talk about that, but it does include, for example, he's been CEO of a Royal Charter institution and charity. He's done 10 years with ICI PLC, and he's a board member, trustee, and chair of several charities. So he does come, as I say, with a good CV. And the subject is making difficult decisions. And again, I think David's presentation will explain what that is admirably, but we're constantly faced with making difficult decisions within charities, whether we're trustees or whether we're CEOs or senior staff. And we're looking here really at difficult financial decisions. When we put this together, we were thinking as an example, no more than that, of sort of what do you do when you're faced with an unacceptable deficit budget? You've got to make some difficult decisions about what to do about that. That's just one aspect that I'm sure David will touch upon in his presentation. So I'll say no more, but hand over to David Brown. Thank you very much and welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that very generous introduction. If I may, I'll attempt to share my screen. Find the right one. Okay, hopefully you can now see a title slide. And please shout if you can't. So making difficult decisions. It's often said that the 2 things you can't avoid in life are death and taxes. But for those of us involved in running charities, indeed any large organisation, the 3rd element is certainly the need to make decisions, and sometimes to make decisions under rather difficult circumstances. And of course, the environment we're in at the moment, for a whole variety of reasons, certainly constitutes difficult circumstances. Let me attempt to advance the slide. Why can't I advance the slide? Oh. Success. Right, so a little bit about me first of all. As David mentioned, I, for about 10 years or so, ran the Institution of Chemical Engineers, which is a large membership institution with certainly at the time I left, 40-odd thousand members around the world, most of whom were no trouble at all. There were unfortunately one or two exceptions. Prior to that, I headed one of the practices at Arthur D. Little Limited, which is a large international consultancy, and did various other things. Perhaps relevant to today, though, is that I've served on the board of a regional development agency, which, of course, is a non-departmental public body with all that implies in terms of Nolan principles and good governance and so forth, and as a trustee of a number of charities. A couple of examples would be a national body in the engineering sector, but also a social care charity in the area where I live, looking at services to carers. I now do a variety of things, some of which are with the Cranfield Trust, as David's mentioned, working with a very interesting variety of charities, actually, on matters of governance and board effectiveness. And certainly, if any of you are so minded to perhaps share some of your expertise, I'm sure the Cranfield Trust would be interested to hear from you. So today's agenda is really in 3 bits. We're going to start by thinking about decision making in general, and the roles of trustees and of staff, the sort of questions that should be asked. We'll then look at what things can happen if it starts to go a little bit wrong, if circumstances or perhaps some of our own poor decisions come back to bite us. And then I want to just raise a couple of cautions, a couple of questions to ask, and I hope to allow plenty of time for some Q&A. Of course, running a charity is sometimes compared to a commercial business, but in fact, it's in some respects more difficult than that, because for a charity, you don't have a simple metric that has a number and a pound sign in front, and if it's a big number, that's good, and if it's a small number, that's bad, and if it's a red number, you're probably out on your ear. And charities need to satisfy several different sets of metrics at the same time. Obviously, financial performance is crucial, but there's also the crucial requirement to deliver public benefit, to maintain the confidence of your various stakeholders, funders, members or supporters, society, and to make sure that the people who receive the services that you provide are satisfied with what they're getting, and hopefully do a bit of recommendation for you. Reputation is something I would like to comment on towards the end, because that's perhaps the most important asset that a charity has, and yet not always an asset that is stewarded as well as it might be. There's constantly a need to balance what I call mission versus market, keeping the business fundamentals right and still delivering what your charitable objectives say you're there for. I believe in Age UK, the head versus heart phrase is used to indicate a similar balance. Public benefit for many charities has to be balanced against delivering value to people who support you, who donate to you, who are, if you have a membership body, to your members who you really like to carry on paying their subscriptions, or you like your donors to carry on donating. And yet the ultimate role of a charity is to benefit society, and to do that in the long term. Businesses can sometimes get away with thinking a rather short-term fashion, and the UK is rather over-prone to that sort of thing. But for a charity, we're here for the long term, and rightly so. So a lot of the responsibility for that rests on the Board of Trustees. This cheerful-looking lot, I hope, is not a reflection of your boards of trustees. And they don't look very diverse, do they? Although I do see at least one female member there. But the trustees have the ultimate responsibility. But of course, trustees are often very good at having ideas, but not quite so good at working out how to pay for them. I'm sure some of you who are looking after the finances of Age UK Enterprises will recognise that problem. And you don't want to stifle the flow of ideas, quite the reverse. But at the same time, You have to pay for them, and sometimes if an idea is to be put into effect, the next question is, what do we stop to make room for it? And what are you going to stop is usually a more difficult question than what could we start? So the staff support for the trustees in their decision making is then essential. Trustees, yes, have the legal responsibility, but it's often staff who have to keep the show on the road. Board members of a charitable body are rather different, in fact very different, from the directors of a company. In a regular company, you have executive directors and you have some non-execs. With a trustee board, they're probably always non-execs. They're all people who may have limited time, limited knowledge, who aren't engaged 5 days a week or indeed 7 days a week, but who appear at meetings and hopefully in between times, but aren't there day to day. That's very different from the position at a company. It puts more responsibility on senior staff. It follows that you have to provide trustees with the right level of detail at the right time in the right format, that you have to deal with individuals on the trustee board or outside that may have some bees in their bonnets and pet ideas that they want to push, well-meaning but not always practical. And absolutely crucial is the relationship between the chair and the chief executive of a charity. If that goes wrong, things are heading downhill and fast. And I've seen too many charities, in my own experience, where that relationship has been, let's say, less than satisfactory. And in the financial context, of course, the relationship between the finance manager, or whoever's responsible for money, and the typically honorary treasurer, or whatever you call them, is another key relationship. The fact is that although trustees ultimately carry the can, the staff will probably know rather more about the governance of charities, and certainly rather more about what happens on a day-to-day basis than most, if not all, of the trustees. So there really is a major responsibility on staff, even though the legal responsibility rests with a trustee board. And that means there needs to be a lot of trust, a lot of confidence, both ways. The relationship between chief exec and chair, and the relationship indeed between trustees and staff, has to be one of a critical friend. And both of those words are important, critical friend. So some questions then to ask. The first one is, can we do it? We want to make a decision, we want to spend some money, or we want to redirect what we do. Can we do that? Does it fit with our charitable objects? Indeed, do all the trustee board fully understand our charitable objects and their implications? What about staff? Do they fully understand what we're there for? What about the volunteers? Sometimes volunteers are perhaps more well-meaning than well-informed, and we need to manage that situation pretty carefully, particularly where money is involved. We need to make sure that the decisions, whether on money or anything else, deliver the basic purpose of the charity and are financially feasible from a business point of view. And then, of course, your governing document will allow certain powers to the charity, and well-written constitutions tend to have a clause at the end of the list of powers that say something like, and whatever else the trustees decide is conducive to the above purpose. That's a catch-all, and it's useful to have, but it's worth checking. Particularly perhaps if your constitution restricts your activities to a particular geographic area, a particular town, and you want to go outside that. So after you've asked the question, can we do what we wish to do? The next question is, should we? Is it actually in our best interests to devote this resource in this way? Does it fit the strategy that we've all agreed? Hopefully we have agreed one. And if not, what we're doing then is perhaps the situation one where strategy has been overtaken by events, just as I think many of our strategies in the charity world have been overtaken by the pandemic over the last 2 years. The Winston Churchill quote, or at least attributed to Churchill, is one I really rather like. However beautiful the strategy, just occasionally look at the results. And then there's a question of what I've called sticking to your knitting. Are we actually the best people to do what is proposed, to undertake the initiative that's proposed? And if we're not, then is there perhaps another organisation, maybe another charity, which would be better placed to do what perhaps a trustee is proposing? And what would be the consequences if we decided not to go ahead? If we decided, no, we can't afford it, it's too risky, what would the impact be upon the beneficiaries of the charity? And indeed on other stakeholders too, us, the staff, for example. Do we actually have all the information we need to make a balanced and well-informed decision? Do we fully understand the information? Do we need expert advice? You know, if you're buying property, if you're recruiting staff, if you're dealing perhaps with a difficult HR situation, maybe you're looking at the possibility of having to lose some staff, then it is often wise to err on the side of caution and get advice, if necessary, pay for advice from suitable experts. Depends, of course, what expertise you have on your board and in your staff base, but by and large, you will need specialists from time to time. Should you actually ask some of the beneficiaries about the decision that we're proposing to take? Perhaps cutbacks in one way or another, or about some new form of service? Would it restrict us from what we want to do in the future? Would we be, perhaps if we're opening a new shop, for example, would we then be landed with a burden which would prevent us from doing other desirable things later on? Do we understand the risks, and have we taken steps to mitigate those risks? We're going to have a whole other session about what a proper risk register should look like. I've seen many that are frankly pretty poor. Risk assessment does involve identifying, yes, the impact and the likelihood of a particular event occurring, but also looking at actions to mitigate the likelihood of an event occurring, or to mitigate the impact if it does. And then crucially, to put a name against each risk and identify who's responsible for keeping an eye on it. And that applies, of course, not only to financial risks, but to a great many other risks as well. And finally, if it all goes pear-shaped, despite our best efforts, what would be the implications? Would it cost us an awful lot of money to change course? Would it damage our reputation if we embark on something that we're not then able to continue with? The overriding duty in all this is prudence, and I won't read through this slide in great detail, but it's the NCVO's summary of what the charitable obligation of prudence means, and it's not a bad idea to just look through that list when we're approaching a major financial commitment. It's not designed to put a damper on what trustees and staff do, but it's a useful set of precautionary questions to ask. And the link is at the bottom. Make the slides available after the meeting, and you can check the link for yourself. So it's important also to think about what you ought to take into account and what you ought not to. Obviously, your charitable objects are relevant. You should look at the best interests of the charity and of its beneficiaries, but you are not supposed to take into account factors that don't actually link to the objects of the charity. Obviously, leave out personal prejudices, leave out trustees' personal views, and sometimes staff may need to gently remind trustees that some views which they may hold in a very sincere way are respected, but are not relevant to the decision in hand. That can be a little tough. Here's an example. I'll just pause and let you take a read through that situation. So here you have a situation affecting a valuable conservation site, which could be really quite important to local people, to the beneficiaries, to the volunteers that you're dealing with. But you need to ask, does this affect the objects of the charity? Another one, ethical investment, something many of us are regard as very important. Indeed, it is increasingly important in the financial world. Trustees may well have strong views about alcohol, tobacco, or whatever, and they may wish to exclude certain investments on that basis. But does that affect the charitable objectives? It may be, perhaps, that they think that beneficiaries or donors would lose confidence in the charity if they knew your money was invested in the wrong sort of stuff, and then you can take that into account. But the fact that a trustee holds a particular personal view on the subject is not something that you can strictly take into account. That can be quite a tough one. When I was chief exec of a charity, one of our trustees expressed a very firm view about investment in a particular sector. I happened to agree with him at the time, but we then had to ask, is this something that would be relevant to our charitable objects? And in fact, we decided in that case that our reputation among members could be adversely affected, because many of the members, this is a bunch of engineers, would have, again, strong views about the way that their society's money was being used. But you need to think carefully what the link is and why a factor may be relevant. Another important issue is to avoid the dominance of individuals. Beware of the hippo. That's the highest paid person's opinion. And it need not necessarily be the highest paid person. It could be the person with the loudest voice or the strongest view, or indeed the person with the most impressive track record that makes you rather reluctant to gainsay them. Again, I could list a number of examples where someone with a very senior business background has joined, perhaps on retirement, has joined a charity board and has frankly behaved rather like they were still a big corporate executive, throwing their weight around a bit. And I could give you at least 3 cases from my own experience where that's had some very unfortunate consequences. To make this work, to make sure everybody has their say, is demanding for whoever's chairing a meeting, be it a chief exec, a chair of trustees or whatever. Ideally, a good chairman should be somebody, or chairperson, should be somebody who listens to everyone, draws out the opinion of each person around the table, and perhaps, if they're the most senior person there, puts in their own view last and not first. Just take a look at the Charity Commission quote at the bottom of the page. The Charity Commission, it's end of 2015, in the aftermath of the Kids Company scandal, which I'm sure many of you will remember, really came down very heavily and quite rightly on the importance of individuals becoming too dominant and, as it were, steamrolling the management team and the trustee board. That could be a dominant chair, often is. It could be a dominant chief executive, as it was in the case of Kids Company, or it could be someone else simply because of the particular personality and background they have. If trustees are just acquiescing to what the loudest voice is saying, then they're not fulfilling their duties as charity trustees. And sometimes those of you who are staff rather than trustees will again have to gently remind the trustee board that they need to ask everyone. Everyone needs to be engaged in the decision. That's a clear requirement in charity law, but it's one that is very often honoured in the breach rather than the observance. A very common issue is the question of optimism bias. You'll remember, those of you who remember your Dickens, Mr. McWhorter, very optimistic. He felt something would turn up. He understood exactly what the financial position was. Look at the second quote here. But if you remember the story, he ended up in prison for debt. So the moral of this story is, don't just assume something will turn up. Do your risk assessment. Work out what's going to happen, your base case, but also ask what's the best plausible outcome and what's the worst plausible outcome. And that will help your decision making. So then if it does start to go wrong, what do you do about it? Do you do nothing and hope? Do you say, where can we get some more income? Either from existing sources or trying to diversify? Do you cut your costs? Do you reduce staff hours? Do you shut your shop an extra day a week? Do you try and cut everything a little bit? Or do you say there are a number of services that we can no longer provide? Very easy to jump to simple solutions. And this isn't just charities, this is businesses as well. If things look difficult, okay, you ban travel, don't go and see customers anymore. Stop your training, stop your hiring, don't recruit this year. Or just, let's knock 10% off everything. And the result very often is people are demotivated, the quality of what you do goes down, you tend to lose the wrong people. There may be redundancies, but then the good people are going to look over their shoulder and think, well, next time it may be me. And they'll be looking around for something else to do, something else, some other organisation to work for or some other charity to volunteer for. And the damage to your reputation can last a lot longer than the financial difficulties. You've all heard the phrase, act in haste, repent at leisure. The chap on the right, William Congreve, the 17th century playwright, coined that. What he actually said is, thus grief still treads upon the heels of pleasure. Married in haste, we may repent at leisure. And I'll make no further comment on that. So then, if you're not going to make simple decisions, if you're not going to act in haste, how do you think more carefully? Well, first of all, you need to understand about, very obviously, current income, current expenditure, be it fixed or be it variable. That should be easy. Sometimes not as easy as you might think, but should be the easy bit. The difficult bit is understanding what might happen, what changes could be on the horizon. What are the trends? If you look at the trends now in the world of particularly charities providing social care, social services, we all know there is a massive crisis in social care. It's on the news practically every night. And I'm sure few of us have confidence in governments of any colour to solve that anytime soon. We've seen reduced funding for local services. One of the things that government centrally is good at doing is blaming local authorities, tasking local authorities with this, that and the other, but failing to provide the resources to enable them to do the job. And many of us, of course, in charities are dependent to some extent on funding under local authority contracts. Non-statutory services are therefore under threat because public bodies can only afford to do what they are legally compelled to do, and sometimes not even that. Charities are under increased scrutiny. You've only to look at recent news stories to see how keen the press are, those paragons of virtue, of course, to really lay into charities for overpaying their staff or for inappropriate use of money or for spending too much on overheads and so on. And overall, of course, we are sadly seeing a move towards, I think, a less open, a less tolerant society. The populists, the nationalists, the right wing are unfortunately exercising more influence than I think many of us would like. And that is colouring people's attitude to, if you like, the people who do have needs in society, people who are in need of support and of help. So, a lot that we need to think about before a decision is made, certainly a decision to make drastic and hasty cuts. Maybe your basic business model needs to be adjusted. The mix of services may need to change. The location or what of your premises and what you use them for may need to change. Now, people are communicating much more online. Services are provided online to a greater extent. Does that affect what physical premises you need? Bearing in mind, of course, that not everyone, particularly perhaps the more elderly, don't have either ready access to online support or are a little reluctant to use it, or a little less able to use it. My generation are not digital natives, and I think we look rather enviously at the millennials and the Gen Zs who've never known a world without social media, online access, instant communication. We had to plan ahead, think in those days. It's a balance of your staff and volunteers, right? Easy to think, well, we can rely on volunteers for more. Volunteers need managing, and I'm sure many of you will know that managing volunteers is not an easy thing to do. You may need to think about fees for services and about interaction with users. So some of the questions then: what does our services really cost? What are our priorities? What might change? Are our premises accessible? Are they user-friendly? What's the cost involved? Volunteers. Do we manage volunteers to consistent standards? If we rely on volunteers too much, are some volunteers going to go off at a tangent and perhaps compromise our reputation? Should we start charging for things we don't charge for at the moment? And whom should we charge? And if we charge for services, are some of the most needy beneficiaries going to be at risk of being excluded? And many different ways in which we can interact with users of our services. So again, important questions before we jump into making perhaps irrevocable decisions. Longer term strategy is also important, and we can have the right balance between ambition and realism. Do we think about who we're going to serve, when and how in the future? What's going to change? One of the other Cranfield Trust jobs I've been doing recently is working with a small neighbourhood association who are finding that the way they provide things like gardening and shopping and companionship and befriending is having to change, partly because the demographics of the area that they serve are going to change. What are your growth ambitions? Are you agreed about what your growth ambitions are? Do you have some staff or some trustees who want to grow, want to do more, want to do it on a bigger scale? Do you have others who think it's actually more important to consolidate what we've got, limit our scope, but do our core activities really, really well? What about partnering? Increasingly, charities can work in partnership to deliver services. What are our relationship to local authorities? Rather than just an arm's length relationship that might involve applying for a grant from time to time, could we have a closer, a more collaborative relationship with local authorities? I have some experience with the City of Sanctuary movement, providing support for asylum seekers and refugees, where what volunteer groups do is made enormously more effective by a really close relationship with those local authorities, those city and town councils that have declared their aspiration to be places of sanctuary. It's far greater than the sum of the parts. Income diversification, we'll come to that in a moment. And are we changing with the environment around us? Are we anticipating changes, or are we running to catch up? And throughout, make sure that you look back at your charitable objects, and maybe you may even need to change your charitable objects as the world around you changes. So a couple of cautions then. The first one is don't just chase the money. We talked about the mission versus market balance a few minutes ago. And it's important to keep that in balance. Money isn't the main aim. You know, if you're running a business, ultimately you're about making a profit, making a sustainable profit, making a profit in a way that's kind to the environment and so on. But ultimately, your key performance metric is money. That isn't the case for a charity. Money is a means to an end. The charity is there to do what its objects say it's there to do, and money is perhaps a, dare I say, a necessary evil to that end. Commercial activities, it follows, need to be obviously aligned with the purpose of the charity, not distract from it, and not alienate supporters. And if commercial activities are there to provide funds to support the charity, it's perfectly legit. You need to think pretty carefully about whether they will pose a risk to the reputation or the brand of the charity, be that locally or nationally. And that is an issue for those charities which are part of a national group, national confederation. Each body is independent, but clearly if you share a brand, if you share a public image, then the way that brand is perceived needs to be consistent. So here's an example. This is a particular Age UK entity, and I've taken the quote here from its website. This particular body is working with a local authority to provide community advice hubs, but look at the list of services. Older people's benefit, yeah. Debt caseworkers, yes. Energy specialists, are we best to do that? Caseworkers in domestic violence, safeguarding, employment. This is not necessarily something you would perhaps always associate with Age UK. Is it consistent with a brand, or would it be seen perhaps, I don't know the details in this instance, but could it be seen perhaps as diluting the emphasis on what the charity is really for? I don't have an answer to that, but I just illustrate it as an example of the kind of situation where you need to think carefully about, are we just looking to increase income, or are we really supporting our core charitable objectives? And that leads us into discussion around diversification, because before making key financial decisions, we really need to think, how dependent are we on our top income streams? Some of us, as I said earlier, are very dependent on local authorities. There are pressures on local authority funding. And so maybe we need to think about, are we over dependent on one source of funds? And if we are going for perhaps a further grant from the same source, will that make us over dependent on that single source? Very much linked to that is a question of how predictable the funding is. If you've got a multi-year contract to deliver a public service, yeah, that's fine. If you've got a great public reputation and your donors keep coming in with donations, then yeah, that's fine. But maybe not all sources of funds are that reliable. Again, the pandemic has hit many organisations in that way, where activities that required face-to-face contact are no longer feasible. Even, for example, in my own experience, going to my wife is a secretary of a local church, and the problem there has been that if you hold online services instead of physical services because of the pandemic, then yeah, you still have costs. You've still got a building to maintain. You may not have to pay so much to heat it, but you've still got a building to maintain. You've still got other costs to cover. But actually, if you're not having physical services, people don't usually donate. There is no collection bag going round. And people, although you give them a details of how they can donate online, people aren't quite as ready to do that as if somebody puts a plate in front of them. And have you asked, what if we diversify in this way? What are the risks involved, just like any other decision? What's the upsides and downsides? Is it going to cost us a lot to develop another funding stream? Do we actually know about that funding stream, such that we have a reasonable chance of it generating some return? You might perhaps be able to share notes with other Age UKs to see what they've found, what they've considered, and avoid making the same mistakes again. Bear in mind that there are lots of people who will promote themselves as professional fundraisers. Some are good, some are just about okay, but a lot of them can't even pay for themselves, let alone generate extras. And that can be a real minefield for a charity that is understandably keen to diversify its income stream. And to return then to reputation. As I've said earlier, local decisions must be taken with the national brand, the brand you all share, in mind. Reputation depends on the bullet points I've got here. Stick to your knitting, meet what stakeholders expect of you, and be prepared to communicate it. Be prepared to articulate what you do, the reasons for the decisions that you make, and how you put those decisions into effect. And I'll give you the famous Shakespeare quote just to add a bit of culture to the session. Reserves policies. Everybody has, I hope, a reserves policy, but sometimes it's a little bit simplistic. It's saying, well, 3 months expenditure or 6 months expenditure. Actually, a better way to deal with the reserves policy is to ask what would be the worst case? You know, what would happen if the sky fell in? If we had to shut up shop, make any staff redundant, discharge any outstanding costs associated with perhaps leases on premises, pay for redundancies, what would it cost? And then, you know, add 20% for safety, and then that would give you a rational reserves policy. And that's a better way to operate, provided that when needed, you refresh it. If you renew, you're taking out another 5-year lease on an office, for instance, that will affect the reserves policy, and you'll need to adjust it accordingly. And that may, in fact, be something you need to take into account if you are deciding whether to take out that 5-year lease, or whether perhaps you ought to pay a little more to take out a lease with a break point halfway through. And of course, the golden rule for any treasurer, it's often tempting to dip into your reserves if things are looking tough, but don't use reserves for keeping the show on the road day to day. Therein lies disaster. On the diversification point, an issue that has become increasingly prominent in recent years is the question of accepting donations. You really need to decide what you would say no to. Even if survival is depending on increased income, there may be some sources of funds that will do so much damage to your reputation that it's best to say no, and to make sure that the basis for making decisions of that kind is clear to all concerned. Universities, which are of course very large charities, have come into very serious trouble in recent times for the sort of donations that are accepted. There's a lot of coverage at the moment, for example, for accepting donations with links to China. Now, that's perhaps unlikely to be an issue for Age UK, but the point is a valid one. Every charity needs to think about what donations they would accept and what they wouldn't. Maybe there are some organisations in your locality which are controversial. Maybe there are individuals which are controversial in some way, and maybe those are best kept at arm's length. And toward the end, that means that when you do meet with the trustees, as I said earlier, you need the right information in the right format at the right time. A good staff team will present options to a trustee board. They will present forecasts, not only what they expect, but the worst plausible case and the best plausible case. They will tell the trustees or advise the trustees what are the decision points, what are the go, no-go points in a programme of work, so that the money tap can be turned off if it needs to be. They will advise on the risks involved and how those risks are being mitigated. And they will make sure that the trustees arrive at a consensus, even if that means just a quiet word, perhaps from the chief executive, that to the chair that says, we haven't really taken so-and-so's view into account. Don't you think we ought to do that? That can test the chief exec chair relationship, but it's important to do that. And in that way, with everybody involved in discussion, with people prepared to agree or disagree, with listening to each other, you get a better decision in the end. And finally, remember, nobody is perfect. Nobody has perfect information, perfect judgment in the charity world, and therefore nobody can guarantee perfect decisions. People will differ, but if you prepare, if you're honest, if you listen, most of your decisions will actually be beneficial to the people whom we are here to serve. So that's it. Here's some details of the Cranfield Trust. If you would like to find out any more, www.cranfieldtrust.org, and happy to take any questions now. But if things do occur to you afterwards, I'm very happy to try and answer them. The details are here. So with that, I'll open the floor for any questions.
David, thank you very much. Very helpful, very informative. There's no questions in the chat yet, but for the participants, the attendees of this, do please feel free to put a question in the chat, or if you'd prefer to ask it, then perhaps raise your hand and we'll try and deal with it that way. Could I just perhaps kick us off with a question myself, David? Turning to reserves, you mentioned about reserves shouldn't be used for day-to-day expenditure, and I would entirely accept that. But would you agree that you could use reserves to smooth out cash flow if there's a temporary trough? In other words, if you can see that there's just a trough in cash flow and the income is going to come in to replace it, you would perhaps dip into reserves for that purpose?
I think I would do that very cautiously, and I would need to be pretty sure that it was just a dip. Personal experience here, you may remember that a decade or so ago, the oil price fell dramatically and very quickly. I was running a body for chemical engineers, very, very many of whom are engaged in either the oil and gas industry or the supply chains and the contractors to that industry. So when the oil price fell, members were less likely. Well, they kept their subscriptions going because they want to keep their CVs in good order, but they didn't subscribe to training courses. They didn't buy publications quite as much, and there certainly weren't jobs advertised in our magazine for which we could obviously levy a fee. So our income took a hit. Now, we were pretty sure, a lot of people were pretty sure, that fall in the oil price was going to be a short-term blip because the oil price does go up and down very rapidly. We resisted the temptation to dip too heavily into reserves, and we made some quite painful decisions quite early on. Fortunately, we did, because the oil price drop wasn't a temporary blip. It was a very long-term thing, and in fact, only now have we seen it really rising to previous heights. So I agree with you, but you need to be pretty sure that it's a short-term blip.
Yeah. Thanks, David. I would agree with that too. I'm just conscious that I know that we've got organisations who do have to rely on their reserves to smooth out cash flow from time to time, and you're right to point out the risks involved in doing that. Have we got any questions from the floor? Yes, Vasco raised your hand. Vasco, do please unmute and ask your question.
Thank you very much. This was a really interesting presentation and very informative, so thank you very much for that. I just had a few questions or comments. One was in terms of recommendations or decisions. So one thing I was just wondering, and I don't know if others have had the same thing, which was where maybe rather than a paper coming to the board and asking for a clear, suggesting a clear recommendation, there might be, for example, a request for a decision, and if that's misunderstood by trustees and somebody, especially the chair or important person, thinks that it's being a recommendation and assuming that there's no objections, it goes through as a recommendation, as a suggestion that we should implement this, then if that might cause a problem. Another thought that I had was in terms of power balance. So, for example, is an AGK charity where there is a membership, where only the trustees are members? Could there be a bigger risk that the trustees have end up with a lot of power than for example, a more wider membership structure where the wider membership can vote on things at least at AGMs, for instance. And then I had a third point about the income, or quite a question about the income and where individual Age UK charities might choose to raise income from, say, trading activities or other grants and commissions, and where they might, for example, purely decide to spend income or subsidize things where it's more to do with the charitable aims of the organisation.
Okay, let me try to address those. On the question of paper to the board, I think it's two things. One is to make it clear whether this is a considered recommendation from staff to the board.
Yeah.
In which case the board, if it's doing its job, will ask, what else have you considered? What were the other options, and why was this particular course of action chosen? The alternative is it actually a suggestion? Are you asking the board to consider an issue, to have a conversation about it, and perhaps for the board to come up with a recommendation? So, I guess it's be clear what the exam question is.
Okay.
To the board, and make sure you provide them with background information necessary. That doesn't mean a 50-page document. It means a very clear sort of one-pager with background to if you want. There's a wonderful quote from Winston Churchill from 1940 about not producing excessively lengthy papers to consider. On the question of the power balance, that's actually a very good question. If it's just the trustees, then clearly they whatever happens, have the ultimate legal responsibility. But they will need to make sure that they are getting themselves properly informed. They need to ask the right questions. They need to put questions to their staff, assuming they have staff. And they need to take expert external advice when they need to. Although it's their responsibility, they are constrained by the charitable objects. Are they benefiting the beneficiaries of the charity? And if they're not, then they need to reconsider. If you have members, that's again very interesting. And again, those of us who run membership organisations will be familiar with that. The trustees make the decisions, and sometimes the trustees will not make a decision which will necessarily be supported by the majority of members, because their question is not what will the members vote in favour of. Their question is what is in the best interests of the charitable objects, what will help us to deliver our benefits. For example, I invested as a chief exec quite significant resource in developing chemical engineering, in our case, overseas, where we were in a position to improve standards of safety and competence in the professions in those areas, because our role, that was what our charitable objectives said we were there to advance. I did have some difficulty with UK members because the UK members didn't always approve of their money being used outside the UK. Okay. So we had to articulate why we were doing that. So, the trustees ultimately are answerable to the members, and if the members don't like it, they can always chuck them out at the next AGM, whatever mechanism the Constitution allows. The trustees need to make sure they're not just going with the lowest common denominator of membership opinion.
Assuming that the members are not, assuming that there's a wider membership base and it's not just the trustees that are members, I guess. And I suppose, in there's a slight difference with commercial organisations where the executives also have a voting right on the board usually. So
that's right. Yes, it's unusual for charities to operate in that way, and it's probably bad. Yeah.
Thanks, Vasco, and thanks very much, David. We've got two questions, please. Can I go to Paul and then Laura? So Paul first.
Yeah, thank you, David. It's just a comment. First of all, really enjoyed the presentation and look forward to going through the slides in more detail. I just wanted to pick up on something which David raised as a comment regarding reserves, when to use them and when not to. And I don't know whether it is common factor, but in our organisation, we had to re-tendered for various services. And what we found was that the local authority changed the frequency and the method of when we were going to be paid for it. And I think that was because they wanted to help their cash flow and just sort of passed it on to us to manage. And I just wanted to make that, just as a comment, whether that's happening nationally, but it certainly meant that in our organisation, we had to look very seriously about. It was unlike the oil situation you mentioned earlier on, we were going to get paid. It was a timing issue, but a very important timing issue.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid comment, actually, because although you may be happy in principle to wait a bit to be paid, your staff are going to want their salary at the end of the month. So and that very much it's a working capital issue, really, and an important one.
Thanks for that, Paul. Yes, a very valid point. Laura, can we come to you, please?
Hi, good morning, everybody. Yes, very interesting presentation, but as a finance manager, I can't help thinking it just means a lot more work again, but there you go. I was interested in Vasco's comments about memberships and trustees and potentially having a member body as well. And I just wondered whether that's common amongst Age UK regional charities. I know the one I work for had members in the past, but had moved away from it. So I was just interested to know whether it's common and typically where do they draw the members from?
Shall I pick that one up, David, or do you go first?
I'll comment in a moment, but after you.
Okay, yeah, Laura, I think you'll find that most local Age UKs do not have members per se. You've got the trustee board, you've got beneficiaries, but there's not that many of our local Age UKs that do have separate members. Some do, but I think it's quite a small minority. There may be others on the call who will now jump in and disagree with me, but that's my experience across the network.
That's, I think, how I would perceive Age UK. But many charities will have, if like a number of people, a body of people who really feel quite strongly in support of what you do. They may not wish to take on the legal responsibility of being a trustee, if they may even not have the opportunity to do that. But it sometimes is worth, if not creating a membership organisation, at least maybe creating a sort of friends of group where you have people with whom you forge a pretty strong connection, and from whom you can perhaps draw future volunteers, future trustees. It's also a way in which you could retain the expertise and goodwill of former trustees. Most charities will have a limited term of office for trustees. They certainly should, otherwise it goes stale. But that doesn't mean that you need to lose people when they come to the end of their term of office. If you have a sort of friends of Age UK so-and-so, it's often helpful, and people who you can call upon to sing your praises if needed. So just a thought.
Thank you, David.
Well,
yes,
thank you for that.
It might even
So thank you for that. I mean, we did try to form. We did start looking into a friends group in about 2019, and then something happened.
Yeah, I know some local Age UKs especially when a trustee is coming to the end of their term, if they don't want to lose them, they sometimes make them a patron. That's another way. That's just perhaps a slightly higher level than friends of psychologically, but that's another way of keeping it. But thank you for that. Are there any more questions? Any more questions for David? Otherwise, it's gone 12 o'clock and we'll begin to draw it to a close. But I don't want to shut anybody down if there are any more questions to be asked. I'm not seeing any more hands up, and there is nothing new in the chat. Final time of asking? I think we're clear, and I think you're clear then, David. Can I just say thank you very, very much for giving your time and your knowledge and expertise to us this morning, David. It's really appreciated. I'm sure it's been very well received by those on the call, and as Paul said, he will look forward to going through the slides in more detail, and I'm sure that will be true for many people on the call. So thank you very much for that. And before we all leave, can I just once again remind you, please, December the 15th is the next one. Do put that in your calendar, please. Details will be coming out shortly about that one, and we'll look forward to seeing you there. But otherwise, thank you, David, and thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Okay, thank you very much.
Fine.
Bye now.